Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Fertilizer Efficiency Fertilization Strategies for Cotton Growers webinar, presented by ICL Growing Solutions. This discussion will explore enhancing fertilizer efficiency to maximize cotton yields and profitability. I'm Hillary Wynn, the Custom Content Manager for Meister Media Worldwide, publisher of Cotton Grower Magazine, and I'll be moderating this webinar. This webinar has been approved for 1 CEU credit in nutrient management from CCA. To receive credit, you must watch the entire webinar. If you've attended our webinars before, this process is a bit different, so please take note. An attendance poll will be sent at some point during the webinar, and you must respond to receive credit. If you respond once the webinar is finished, you will receive an email with the QR code for reporting your credit. You simply scan the QR code and submit it. Please do not close your web browser before the webinar has ended completely, or you will not receive the email with the QR code. This is also for the viewers watching the archived webinar. Now I'd like to go ahead and introduce our panelists, Dr. AJ Foster, Damon Dowdy, and Dr. Katie Lewis. AJ is an Agronomy Technical Services Manager at ICL with nearly 20 years of experience in teaching, research, and crop nutrition. Prior to joining ICL, he served as a University Extension Agronomist and a Research Agronomist with Aromatic Inc. and Lamb Weston. Damon is the owner and lead soil fertility consultant at TerraTek Ag Services. With over 14 years of experience as a Kinsey Albrecht certified consultant, Damon has worked with growers across the U.S. on crops including corn, soybeans, rice, cotton, and more. As the owner of TerraTek Ag Services, he specializes in soil fertility consulting, ag data management, and creating management zones using electroconductivity systems to enhance crop production. Katie is an associate professor at Texas A&M AgriLife Research and has a PhD in soil science. She is dedicated to improving agricultural resilience and sustainability, particularly in the Texas High Plains. As a researcher, her work focuses on alternative soil and nutrient management practices to enhance economic and environmental sustainability. AJ, Damon, and Katie, welcome. At this point, I will turn the webinar over to our panelists.
Okay. Thank you, Hillary, and good afternoon to everyone, or good morning, depends on where you are in the world. And thank you for joining us for this webinar. Today it's going to be with I've just joined with my colleagues, Dr. Lewis from Texas A&M and Damon Dowdy, as Hillary introduced us earlier. And today what we're going to be talking about, let me share our agenda for today for a panel discussion. It's going to start out with an introduction, and I'll give that introduction about ICL. Then we talk about 2 of our products, Polysulfate and NovaFlow. Then we'll dive in to discuss about 4 questions about efficiency, fertilizer use efficiency, potassium sources, timing of application, as well as potassium as a foliar option. And then we kind of discuss some insights and talk about some other stuff as well. And then we'll open up for Q&A. So I'll start with the ICL story. So ICL is a 100-year-old global crop nutrition company, and we're involved in a lot of different things. We have an industrial division that focuses on bromide and offering bromide solutions. We also have a phosphate solution division that is more involved in ingredients for various industrial and food applications. Also, we got a potassium division that's focused on providing potassium from a commercial standpoint for potassium fertilization. And then the division which I'm a part of is the Growing Solution division, and we're focused on specialty fertilizers, from which I'll be talking about these 2 products today. So the first product I want to talk about is our Polysulfate. And Polysulfate is a natural mineral. It's a multi-nutrient fertilizer, natural mineral derived from the mineral polyhalite. It consists of 4 nutrients: sulfur, potassium, magnesium, and calcium. And what makes Polysulfate unique is that it is a slow, sustained release fertilizer. So all these nutrients are released in a slow, sustained form, and it is in a single granule. A lot of times we get a lot of questions that ask, is it in a blend? No, it's a single granule with each granule consisting of all 4 nutrients. And so the advantage of it being a slow release means that you get more nutrients into the plant. So you get a better nutrients uptake, better efficiency of getting these nutrients into the plant. Additional to it being slow release, it has low chloride, which is ideal for sensitive crops. It has a neutral pH, low salt index, and also it's the lowest carbon footprint fertilizer available commercially in the marketplace. And it's naturally sourced, and it's UMRI certified and approved for organic production. So polysulfate on cotton, we have done some research looking at it on cotton in the University of Georgia, and just want to provide just some highlight of what we learned from those trials. The results of this trial, if you really need to gain more detail, you can always reach out to us and we'll provide the additional detail. We got technical as well as sales sheet that goes in more details on these studies. But the overall take-home message from this study, looking at polysulfate from 2020 to 2023 on a 3-year average, is around a 20% increase in lint yield with the use of polysulfate compared to a grower standard or a control. In terms of, we also in 2023 looked at polysulfate across different states, look at it in Georgia, Texas, and North Carolina. And what we observed there was a 13% increase in yield compared to the grower standard. One thing I want to point out is in some of it, like in Georgia, the control had no sulfur involved in that. But when we look across it in Texas and North Carolina, those did have sulfur and but the key was the potassium, a much lower rate of potassium application going with the polysulfate. The next product I want to talk about is our NovaFlow. NovaFlow is a 5-10-20 with magnesium, 9% magnesium and 11% sulfur. And this is designed for foliar application. And it's designed as an alternative for magnesium and potassium nitrate. And it's predominantly recommended for application during the reproductive stage. What makes NovaFlow pretty unique is that with potassium and magnesium, they're pretty much antagonistic for uptake into the plant. But once they get into the plant, they're synergistic. So NovaFlow is designed to take advantage of that synergistic relationship between magnesium and potassium in the plant. So this leads us to our beginning of our panel discussion, which would involve me asking a couple of questions, kind of laying some groundwork or some around those questions, and I'll bring in my panelists, Dr. Lewis, as well as Damon Dowdy, for us to have this discussion. I asked Dr. Lewis and Damon to join me for this presentation for a couple of reasons. For us, we're the manufacturer of these products, but when we look at it from that standpoint, we're the manufacturer, we produce these products. Dr. Lewis, she works as an academic, which focus on establishing and studying these relationships, while Damon is a practitioner that actually evaluates these relationships. So and be able to verify and validate these relationships. So this gives us 3 different perspectives of looking and answering these questions. So my first question is, why is efficient fertilizer so critical in today's farming? And we want to frame that question around, when we think of fertilizer efficiency, I want to frame it around what we consider the 4 R's. For me, when I think of the 4 R's, I see the 4 R's more as a fundamental concept that surrounds the whole principle of soil fertility or nutrient management. And it's, in that sense, it's more like an aspiration, something that we're trying to accomplish each and every year. Sometimes we may get there, get it right, sometimes we won't. So I'm just curious, both Dr. Lewis and from Damon, to kind of get you guys' perspective when you think of the 4 R's and when you think of fertilizer use efficiency, how does those pieces actually comes together? And whichever of you wish to start first, that's okay.
Yeah, so I can take a stab at that. So when I think of the 4 R's, I think of it being very specific to the environment that you're working in. So for example, what we do that would be considered more of a 4R practice in the high plains of Texas may be very different than what Damon does in his area of the US. And so we have to take it with an environmental approach to it, but then how do we optimize what we're doing from a cropping systems perspective with our fertilizers? And to me, talking about enhanced efficiency fertilizers, they're going to have to be managed slightly differently when we are incorporating those into a cover crop system or a crop rotation, reduced tillage. And so all of those, exactly like this picture indicates, we have to fit those pieces together to have an optimized system for a specific environment.
I'll add a little to that. As a Kinsey Albrecht student, I'm mostly or acutely interested in balancing soil, and just any soil that has a deficiency is going to have an equal excess of something. And many times, particularly in high mag areas, which is where a lot of southeast Missouri and northeast Arkansas, a little bit of southern Illinois, most of that is high magnesium, and you can dissipate and control a lot of that sometimes with calcium, but eventually you're going to get to the point where you have a limited number of ways to deal with excesses, and sulfur is one of the main ways to deal with that. And what's nice about polysulfate, and I guess trying to fold it into the 4Rs, what's nice about polysulfate is one material has a lot of sulfur, and then also inside that, when that sulfur knocks off a cation, like a calcium or a high mag or something like that, then polysulfate has a potassium, which is usually what you're going to want to replace a magnesium with. It has that available, so that's quite an efficient product to use, I think.
Yeah. Continuing on the efficiency aspect as well, and then Dr. Lewis, I know you have done work in this area, and you're doing some work in this area, and Damon, you probably seen over the years, is the question of older varieties versus newer varieties in terms of efficiency. And this is a study that was done that compared 1940 varieties versus 1980 varieties. And it's showing that newer varieties tend to accumulate K much faster than older varieties. What are, Dr. Lewis, based on your work, what you have seen, what are your thoughts on that? And Damien, are you seeing from your recommendation in the field, are you starting to see, is there an increase in recommendation of potassium just based on these newer varieties? So, Dr. Lewis, you want to go first?
Sure, yeah. So we, 2021, had a paper published looking at different varieties and a range of maturities. So we have Paymaster HS26, Fibermax 958 versus Delta Pine 1646. And we were looking at uptake rates as well as partitioning of macro and micronutrients within those varieties. And it would go perfectly with this figure you have here to add just an additional line to it that would be earlier than that Mullins and Burmeister. So we do find that nutrients are being taken up, specifically potassium, being taken up earlier within the growing season at much faster rates compared to our older cultivars. And so what that means from a management perspective is we have to be on top of the demand of the crop. We have to be ahead of that, making sure that we're not applying too late into the growing season to affect some of the growth habits of the cotton crop.
Thank you, Dr. Lewis. Mm-hmm. Damon, what are you seeing in the field? Are you seeing an increase in rates of potassium being applied in types of recommendations you're making? Are you changing those recommendations based on varieties?
Well, I think you could probably blame most, if not all of it, on varieties, but the plants are much more vigorous today than they have been in prior years. I mean, to the point where uh, we've tried to be very stingy with nitrogen just to keep the things from being so vegetative. But if I had to guess, I got nothing to back it up, but I got a feeling they're able to access, mineralize, and use potassium much more efficiently. Which potassium in a plant generally helps grow bulk, and I think that's probably some of the success that some of these newer varieties have had. They can very easily grow bulk. They can grow solar panels, and then they want to they want to stay vegetative, and you just have to manage that real hard. But yeah, I think they're able to access potassium in different ways than some of the earlier varieties, I guess.
Yeah.
I have nothing to back that up, though.
Yeah. To add to that, Damon, so to build off of the work that we did, we started working with Bayer Crop Science to evaluate 10 more modern cultivars and separating those into early, mid, and full varieties to see if we can't piece out how we need to be managing varieties based on the maturity classification. And so that's also something to keep in mind, that they're not all going to develop at the same rate. And so we may have to fertilize differently based on that maturity classification.
Yeah. Yeah. No, thank you guys for that. Yeah, I do think, and I do agree with that. More on that work you just mentioned is looking at it in terms of fertilization versus based on maturity. I think that's what that does make a difference in terms of the amount of fertilizer varieties will need is going to be based on its maturity. The continuing the same on efficiency is soil testing, and get you guys' perspective on this. I mean, for me, I've working with growers over the years, this always a pain point for a lot of growers is soil tests. They all you get the growers come in and says, I soil test 2 years ago, and you ask them, did you fertilize based on it? And they can't tell you where the soil test is. They just know, they just tell you they did it. And because the confidence that they seem to have in those results. And I like to explain to growers that soil testing is really about the probability of a response. So you really want to know, are you low, are you high, are you in the middle? And if you're low, you got a higher probability of response if you apply. And so I'm just curious as for you guys, and Dr. Lewis, you've worked in this field with soil testing as well, improving on that. And for Damon, you have been making those recommendations. So I'm curious to get you guys' perspective on soil testing and how you see us improving grower confidence in soil testing. Another point I want to make before I hand over to you guys is on the base saturation. That's also another way in that growers, I think this is more of an industry concept more than university in making recommendation based on cation base saturation. And so curious to get you guys' thoughts on that in terms of soil testing in general, and how does that fit into enhancing efficiency and improving grower confidence in using soil tests, because we still believe it's also part of the fundamentals of it if we're going to improve efficiency.
Yeah, potassium soil testing is a challenge. And the reason I feel that way is that we, Cotton Incorporated, supported a project that we conducted we had 27 site years across the cotton belt, And we had soils that would be 2 to 3 times greater than what the critical level was for a Malic 3 extraction, and we would still see a response to added potassium. Or the opposite end of that spectrum, we would have soils that were half of what the critical level was, but yet we still couldn't see a consistent response. And so to me, potassium soil testing, there's going to be other contributing factors, such as the base cation saturation. So maybe you have a soil that is extremely high in potassium. I say extremely high. It's high, very high in potassium, so greater than what the critical level would be, but you also have high magnesium. And so there may be some antagonism for plant uptake there that you're not capturing with just a traditional soil test. And so I think considering, and I know I'm going against what maybe some academics would say, but I think considering other cations that are in the soil that could be reducing uptake of potassium is extremely important when it comes. So don't just focus on what your soil test level is, but pay attention to those other cations. Exactly like what Damon said earlier about keeping the soil balanced. If there's something that's deficient, then there's something that's likely in excess.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's cool to hear somebody with a doctor's in front of their name to say that kind of stuff. And, I parrot what she just says. You know, potassium will only stay around and stay on a clay colloid at a pH of under 6.5. So if you've got a pH of 6.5 or higher, potassium, it's very likely going to be tied up with calcium and magnesium on that clay colloid. If it's sodium, that's a different situation. But for the most of this part of the world, it's calcium, magnesium. So if you want to get potassium to stick around, or hopefully even build up to that healthy 5% base saturation, you're going to need to remove whatever is bigger and let's just say a bigger bully. So you need to remove one or both of two of those things off of there so it has room to stay around. And that's where sulfur is a good tool for that. And I don't sell the stuff, but polysulfate is gonna be a more important tool moving forward, because the sulfur can knock off the excess, and then it has a potassium ready to lock on and build. So, but yeah, she's right. You got to make room for potassium. Otherwise, it'll stay in soil solution, eventually run off if you're above a 6.5 pH.
And AJ, I'll add just one thing here. Yep. That's not necessarily included on this slide, but something that we've been working on recently in work that has been done in North Dakota is by Dave Franzen, is looking at the mineralogy of the soil, which I do find to be extremely important. So especially in 2-to-1 clays where potassium can be fixed within those clay layers, there is potential for, when we extract with an ammonium-based extractant, that we could be overestimating what is going to be or is currently plant available. And so we are working with Cotton Incorporated to try to develop an improved soil testing method where we are accounting for the mineralogy of the soil and how that might influence what is available.
Yeah. Thank you, guys. Let's move to that was some very good points there, guys. Let's move to our next question, so we can stay on time. The next question is, does the source of potassium make a significant difference in crop performance? And when we look at it, let's look at it this way. Traditional potassium fertilizer source, if we look at it from a soluble to more or less soluble or slow release, if we look at the soluble sources, the potassium acetate, that would predominantly be foliar, potassium chloride, which is the MOP or predominant source, and then potassium nitrate. Then you'll have in the middle, less soluble would be the potassium magnesium sulfate, potassium sulfate, and then polysulfate would be the least soluble source. But when we typically in cotton production and for in the Southeast and in the South, MOP is predominantly the dominant source, not so much a potassium sulfate source. And so some of the work we have done, one of the work we have done looking at SOP versus MOP is with you comparing both potassium magnesium sulfate as well as polysulfate and looking at it from nutrient uptake into the plant. And looking at you're looking at 120 pounds of K2 applied with MOP versus 28 pounds applied with SOP coming from both potassium magnesium sulfate as well as polysulfate. And what we're seeing, even with those lower rates with the sulfate form of potassium, there is pretty much similar there's not a big difference in uptake, especially early in the season. And then later in the season where because most of this is taken at about first bloom, and then the latter is taken at bowl set, where we're seeing the big advantage is poly tends to drop a little bit, maintain a little higher than potassium magnesium sulfate, and that has to do with solubility. And so it's really holding true to the solubility of these different sources on how that they're making that potassium availability and uptake into that plant. I'm just curious to hear from you guys. From you, Dr. Lewis, what have you been looking at different sources of potassium in terms of addressing some of the issues we have, especially in cotton, where we tend to run out later in the season? And same thing for Damon. Have you looked at different sources in addressing that potassium issue in cotton?
Yeah, we have done some side-by-side comparisons with KCl versus a potassium sulfate formulation. And we do consistently see more responsive yields with potassium sulfate or polysulfate or some potassium acetate formulations. And I think a lot of that goes back to potentially the sulfur addition with those fertilizers and the benefit that that provides from a salinity perspective. And it's not something we've talked about here or so far, but how drought has potentially influenced our salt concentrations over the last few years. And so I think there is the synergistic effect of adding potassium with sulfur in those cases.
In my world, potassium sulfate is it's just got a stigma with it of way too expensive. I can't get fertilizer dealers to stock it because they just feel their clients won't buy it. It's too expensive. So we're relegated to potash, which I was just talking to AJ earlier about it. I think particularly on low exchange, under 9 exchange, 8 or below, when you use high rates of potash, you're getting probably ill effects from that chloride. Luckily, chloride is extremely mobile, and a couple of rains and it's gone. But I think probably early in emergence, it's having ill effect on the seed emerge, but that's what we've got to work with. I think finally, you've got a sulfur product that's got some potassium in it that can start. They can start blending that potash in lower concentrations using more polysulfate material with potassium in it. Use it as a potassium source, and I got a feeling that's probably going to be a pretty good tool.
Yeah. And yeah, thank you guys. And Damon, we have a trial this year, and that was one of the first things when I came out and we were looking at it, split field trial that you had there in Missouri. And that was one of the big difference we saw in that trial was it looks like the polysulfate side just had much more plants, seems from the emergence, which seems to be the impact from not having that much chloride, that potassium chloride salts. We just seems to be getting much better emergence.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I agree with that.
So let's move to our next question. Thank you, guys. And this has to do with application. When is the best time to apply K for your optimal results? And potassium, we see, according to a lot of research, this is a study I want to show here. It's a couple of studies that conclude that the best time is that uptake rate in that 60 to 100 days after planting. And here we show some studies from the 1940s up to early 2000 into the 2000, and showing the amount of K per day that's required. And we see predominantly, for me, some of the, not in cotton, but my experience from potatoes, I tend to see where with K, the earlier, we normally say we want to get most of that K on in crops like potato before day 70. Or pre-plant, and trying to get most of that application before that time frame. I'm just curious to hear what you guys think in terms of timing of application that you typically recommend for you, Damon, to growers, and for you, Dr. Lewis. I know you have done work on this as well, looking at the best timing for application for potassium.
Well, definitely get some potassium on it at pre-plant. But remember, potassium in a high pH soil, which is a lot of us, is not going to stick around. So we've been doing some mid-season applications of potassium, even granular potassium mid-season, and getting some response from that. But late season foliar from, first bloom on, that works. That can be a good return on investment there. But I'm not real. I don't really know about the pounds per acre per day. I've never really tracked that. It's interesting to look at, but.
Yeah, so back to what we were talking early on, how uptake curves have changed. And it's not that the total amount of potassium has changed simply because our yield potential has gone up, but the actual uptake index of potassium hasn't changed all that much, or has even improved. So less is needed per pound of yield. On a pounds per acre per day, I would say that holds true as well. But again, we've shifted to earlier in the season as far as when the plant actually starts taking up and partitioning those nutrients. So I feel like earlier in the 60 to 100 days is always my recommendation. The earlier you can get it out, the better. I agree with Damon that an early pre-plant application close to planting is going to be necessary, but then not going past that 60 to 70 days for an in-season application would be extremely important. Definitely get an earlier application out. Don't wait to put all your potassium on in season.
So, and then this is just an additional question before I ask you guys on the foliar side, because even on foliar, there is a timing for that as well. And this is an older study, but in the late 90s, that look at it for foliar as well. So you're saying even for soil apply, there is a window where you have to make that application. Here, this study also show for foliar that there is also a window where is that after first bloom, your best response for potential for get a yield increase is within that first week, 4 weeks. And so a lot of times when we talk about fertilization, we don't really talk about these windows that are available that you need to, or time frames that you got to get those application in, or because if you get outside of those windows, you start to see the potential for responses start to diminish pretty quick. But what I want to hear, what about, like Damien mentioned earlier, about blending sources like polysulfate plus like an MOP, where you start to adjust the availability based on the solubility that we talked about. I'll be curious to hear how would that change timing of application? How would you do that when you start to, does that gives you more flexibility on your timing and your foliars and these, and shift these timing of application?
Well, I'm still learning about polysulfate. If you've got the proper amount of moisture, when will that potassium be highly available coming from polysulfate, AJ? If you've got
It
good, if you've
depends
got
on moisture.
good
We
moisture.
have about, let's say, around 70 days. The release pattern is over a 70-day period.
So it's out at 70?
Yeah, pretty much. Let's put, it's depend on moisture, but with good moisture, that's kind of, let's say it's a 70-day release over a 70-day period.
Yeah. Well, then I think that would be that would enhance a potassium application if it was blended with potash. I think that's exactly kind of what you're looking for. Personally, you know, and I'm gonna feed the soil, guys. I want to get the right amount of potassium in the soil so that the crop can feed primarily from the soil. I've got nothing against foliars, but I look at that as kind of a band-aid to a problem in the soil, to be honest with you. But sometimes they're absolutely necessary because it's either you don't have enough time or not enough money to fix a soil for that season or even prior or subsequent seasons. So, you know, I got no problem with foliar, but that's interesting. I think those two marry pretty well, potash and polysulfate. That'll be some late season potassium coming from the polysulfate.
Yeah. Any thoughts on that, Dr. Lewis, before we move to her?
Yeah, so we have seen positive responses with foliar applications, but it's always coupled with a soil-based program as well. And I think right there, just like that figure illustrates, sometime early in flower development is when the optimal time for a foliar application is. If you go too late, obviously it's not going, we've seen that in some of our trials, it's not going to be beneficial to late yield.
And so that brings us to our next question on foliars. We kind of dive into that a little earlier. Is foliar potassium truly valuable, or they're more alternative to that? And Damien, you talked about you see foliar more as a band-aid, but here are some results from some of our studies, and Dr. Lewis is familiar with these studies as well. But this is when we combine polysulfate with our NovaFlow. So this is a system where we're combining both together. And in 2023, we saw a really good response of almost a 20% yield increase across Texas and Georgia. But so far in 2024, we repeated it in 2024, we're seeing around 11% yield increase. I'm a firm believer I think foliar does provide some good advantage when combined with a good soils program. But I do think it's a lot of times, from my experience of working in potatoes, is we used to use this term in potatoes is that foliar allows for what we call a smooth landing. And when we say that it's a smooth landing, is you start, when I showed that chart earlier where you take that first plant analysis and it's really high, and then later in the season it drops. What foliar does, it makes that drop a lot smoother, so you don't get these steep drops. And that tends to help that crops to maintain higher yield and quality. But what we have seen is that yield and quality, whether you're going to get that increase, tends to be dependent on yield potential that year, which is connected to environment. And so like you look in 2023, we saw a really good response. Looked like in 2024, yield potential was a little lower. So we didn't see as big of a response in 2024 as we did in 2023. But I do think, and I get you guys' opinion on that, but I do think a complement of the foliar and, as Dr. Lewis mentioned earlier, of a good soils program complemented with foliar tend to set you up for a pretty much better yield, providing conditions are good. And so it seems to be a good insurance management policy that will help. I get you guys' thoughts on that.
Yes.
Well,
so go ahead, Damon.
Well, I was just going to mention it. You know, it has a lot to do with the climate and the environment of that you had in those first days. I mean, sometimes if you've got, you know, heavy rainfall throughout the growing season, you know, that foliar gets to be an easy return on investment because you're going to need it. It's gone from the soil. That's what I was going to add. Go ahead, Doc.
Yeah, so, you know, we do our best to make good predictions of what our yield's going to look like, but it never fails that we see our potassium deficiency oftentimes later in the growing season. And, you know, some might argue that that's just the plant partitioning K to the fruiting structures, but it's still a deficiency symptom that's appearing later in the season, and that we have identified to be potassium. So to me, that foliar application in those situations where maybe our yield looks a little better than we predicted, or maybe we just didn't fertilize at the level that we are producing, I think that the foliar application, like you said, AJ, can get us to that finishing line.
Yeah. And I think this is my last question is, why should grower consider ICL products as part of their fertilization strategy? And for me to answer that is, when you think of polysulfate, it's probably one of the most versatile type of fertilizers that's available. It's a multi-nutrients providing both sulfur, potassium, magnesium, and calcium. And it's all in a slow release form. And that being in a slow release form allow for more nutrients into the plant. And as Damien talked about, when you combine with MOP, in which you're really taking advantage of having that multiple sulfate source of potassium, of potassium to increase the amount of potassium in supplying the potassium to the plant and having a quick release as well as a slow release. And I think, Damien, you kind of mentioned this. I think predominantly in the Southeast and in the South is the cost of SOP has always been a detractor for a lot of growers, seeing it as an option for, especially in cotton production. And I think a good blend with polysulfate will offer some good option for a lot of growers that's looking to, the way I would look at it, to diversify your potassium source. That's really what you'll be doing, is having more diverse potassium source. And that's solving two problems, because we know sulfur is also a deficient nutrient predominantly in the Southeast as well, and in the Southern US. So you're able to supply sulfur while at the same time providing that potassium that could sustain in the late season. And that in combination with Nova Flow, which is that takes advantage of the synergy of the magnesium as well as the potassium, and applying that during the reproductive phase to really help to smooth the landing and help to prevent any deficiency that you may have late in the season. So for me, I too think this system really works really well together in having both polysulfate and Nova Flow as a really good fertility program, but also thinking of a combination of polysulfate with that MOP to diversify your potassium source. Any thoughts from you guys?
You said it beautifully.
He really did. He really, yeah. I mean, and you forgot to mention calcium in there too. I think you mentioned magnesium, but you know, there's just crop feeder amounts of calcium and magnesium in it that I think are always, you know, beneficial. Nice plant available forms of them that you know, it's attractive about it.
Yeah, I like to call polysulfate the mutual fund of sulfates. So, so with that, we'll open up for questions. So, any questions from the audience? So we'll let Hillary
Yeah, we do have some questions from the audience, so we'll just go ahead and dive into those. Can this product go through drip tape without clogging the tape?
No, it's a dry granular product. So we don't recommend applying it to go through a drip tape, and it doesn't. So we're in the process of working on a suspension that possibly could solve that problem, but we're not there yet with that.
What do you see as the ideal ppm of potassium or percentage of the base saturation on the CEC?
On which CEC?
That's all the question says.
Well, I'm going to generally say push it toward 5% base saturation. A cotton farmer that doesn't fight with sodium can try to push that up towards 7. But 5 is a beautiful place to kind of hang around at if you can build it to that percent of the base saturation.
Agree with that.
Yep.
All right. What concentration of potassium would you prefer in the plant at pinhead square?
So if we're talking about leaf concentrations, then I would say somewhere around 2.5% would be ideal that early in the growing season. 2.5 to 3.
Yeah.
Okay. Isn't polysulfate known as a sulfur source?
Yes, it is. It is known as a sulfur source, but bear in mind the sulfate is in the potassium form as well as the magnesium as well as the calcium. So that also make it able to supply not only sulfur but potassium, magnesium, and calcium as well. And is also the way it breaks down. That's what makes poly pretty unique. So the way it's going to break down, it's going to start with the magnesium, which is more soluble. So the magnesium sulfate is going to break down first, and then you start weakening the crystal lattice and making the potassium and then the calcium. And all through those nutrients are available around this pretty much at the same time, but it's really due to having that diverse nutrients in it of the magnesium, potassium, and calcium. So you really get a slow release of the sulfate. That's why we can say that 70 days release, but not just sulfur, but all the nutrients.
With the drought that we've experienced, how will it influence the potassium inputs we choose?
I'll let Dr. Lewis, you want to take that one? You deal with that more often than any of us.
Sure. Yes. And that's something that my colleagues and I have been talking about, industry colleagues specifically in the area, that, one of the things we've noticed in our 3rd year of pretty serious drought is that potassium deficiency is becoming more prevalent, likely because of the salts that are being accumulated in our irrigated systems. Our irrigation water has pretty high concentrations of magnesium and calcium, and so that can be antagonistic to the uptake of potassium. So really be on top of your potassium management strategies. I think even more so in the next few years, potassium inputs are going to be necessary to help offset the divalent cations that have been added through our irrigation water and concentrated there at the surface of the soil, just to prevent any potassium deficiency.
So, and to that, when you think of that from that standpoint, Dr. Lewis, I'm just following up on that. Does that a potassium sulfate source, does that makes a huge difference in that in those?
Absolutely. Yeah. And this may have been mentioned earlier a little bit too. So with the sulfur there, it's going, I think Damon mentioned it, and he can probably explain this better than I can, but the sulfur is going to help with making the potassium more available throughout that growing season, especially with the salinity issues that you'll be experiencing following drought periods.
Okay.
Yeah.
No, Damien, you got something to add?
No, she said that correctly. I would just end up saying the same thing Dr. Katie did.
All right. It looks like we have one last question. I am located in the southeastern U.S. How does regional location influence the selection of potassium sources?
I'll start with that, and you guys can chime in on that as well, because we got Dr. Lewis is in the more in the west Lubbock area, and Damon, you're in Missouri. For me, because I've worked, I work from Arizona to the Carolinas, and what I've seen is predominantly in the drier areas. I mean, polysulfate is predominantly used as a potassium source, and as a potassium sulfate source in those dry areas. As you move to where you're getting more and more rainfall, it becomes more important as a sulfate source, because again, it's more rainfall and sulfate is more easily leached. So that's where it's more as that, because of its slow release on the sulfate side. And then as Dr. Lewis mentioned, it's there as compared to MOP, especially because of your the salinity issues, you really want to go with the sulfate form of potassium. So it all depends on the conditions that you have, but predominantly in areas where you're going to have more rainfalls, you're going to want to go with it. It's more for a sulfate source in providing that slower sustained release of sulfate. In areas where you may have salinity or salt issue, it goes in as a potassium source in providing that potassium. But it does both in either areas. You're still going to get the benefit of the potassium as well, and calcium and magnesium.
As a soil balancer, I probably would, or not probably, I would look less at geography and look more at, what's in and not in the soil from the lab data, and then I would try to marry that with what is economically available in your area, and then try to marry that with a happy selection of something you can make money with. But I think you're right. If you're in a high rainfall area, stay with that sulfate form of not just potassium, just about everything. I think that will work better. And polysulfate, I guess, is even slower than potassium sulfate. Is it, AJ?
Yes, that is correct. So because it has the calcium sulfate in it, that makes it a little much slower than the potassium sulfate by itself.
Yeah. Potassium sulfate's got a higher concentration of potassium.
It does. It's almost 50%, over 50%.
All right. Well, that was all of our questions. So I want to thank everyone for attending today's webinar. I especially want to thank ICL for presenting it. And a special thanks to our panelists, AJ, Damon, and Katie, for providing essential information for enhancing fertilizer efficiency and improving cotton production outcomes. If you would like to watch the webinar on demand or revisit certain parts, it will be archived and available at the same link you used to access it today. You will also receive an email reminder of the archive with the link tomorrow. For more information on ICL, please visit www.icl-growingsolutions.us. Thank you again for joining us. This concludes the webinar.
Well. Thank you.